Jim Sullivan has served as the executive director of the Bennington County Regional Commission for the past 12 years and has been with the BCRC for the past 33. He's now retired, but will be staying on in an advisory capacity until just before Christmas. One of the areas he took a great interest in was in energy policy, along with the siting of renewable energy facilities to help move the transition from fossil fuels to cleaner energy sources along. Recently, we had the chance to hold a conversation with him that focused on the permitting process, among other things, since that permitting process can sometimes seem long and arduous for developers who would like to play a role in that transition, but frequently face obstacles. So we sat down with Jim on a Zoom call to hear his analysis of why that is.
Yeah, well, just in general, and I can't really get into the nuances because I don't really understand them myself. Talk to someone from the Public Utility Commission, or even better, a developer of these projects to give you the real insights. But the big picture basically is that these projects, for any type of energy generation or transmission project, has to go through the Public Utility Commission in Vermont, which used to be known as the Public Service Board until a few years ago. And everybody kept getting it confused with the Public Service Department, so they changed the name, which is probably a good move. And anyway, the Public Utility Commission's process is variously referred to as Section 248, or the Certificate of Public Good process. And that looks at these projects from the perspective of both the environmental impacts and the criteria that they look at under the environmental impacts are very similar to those that the state Department of Environmental Conservation looks at through the Act 250 process. And then they also look at issues of grid capacity and the need for this for the amount of power, the capacity of the generation, from a statewide perspective. So the so-called public good aspect of it, I guess. So that's the process. It's a pretty difficult process from my experience. It's very legalistic. They're helpful at the PUC and the Public Service Department, which participates in these processes, kind of the advocate for the citizens of Vermont. But it's still a very legalistic process, and there's lots of requirements and standards and forms, and it's difficult to really become a party to a hearing, which in the just to make it sound all the more officious and intimidating, they don't call it party, they call it intervener. So it's difficult to become an official intervener without hiring a lawyer. So even the Bennington County Regional Commission that I work for, we tend to just submit testimony based on our regional plan rather than get involved as a so-called intervener, because it's so time-consuming and expensive to get involved as an intervener. So we've only done that in my experience at the Regional Commission over the last 30 plus years, twice as the BCRC intervened, but we've submitted testimony as as an interested organization dozens of times.
So, how long do these sort of permitting processes for renewable energy projects typically take? Are we talking a couple of years, or is it more like a year or less, or what's the
It could be. I think it depends very much on the size and complexity of the project, because I don't know, just to wind it back a little bit, this process, the Section 248 process, was really created in the days of yore, when energy generation projects were big projects, right? There were no little energy generation projects. There would be a big coal-powered plant or a nuclear power plant or a massive new transmission line or a gas pipeline or something like that. And so the process that is set up is pretty comprehensive to consider these various issues. for these large regional generators, principally. Then, come back to the more recent days when all of a sudden, the state is faced with literally hundreds, if not thousands, of smaller scale renewable energy projects, solar and wind projects, scattered all over the landscape of Vermont. And somehow they're trying to adapt this process. It was really set up for these huge projects to deal with all these small projects, some of which should be simpler, except for the fact that they're located, potentially anywhere in the state. Whereas these big projects, used to be located like along a river in an industrial park or whatever. These new projects are smaller, a lot of them, but they're located in, cornfields or out in the woods, or, in a shopping center parking lot or whatever. So it really, as I said, it really does depend. A lot of the smaller projects, I think, there's the smallest ones. There's kind of like an administrative level review that could probably take 2 or 3 months once the agreements are all worked out with the electricity distribution company. The middle-sized ones that require kind of an intermediate level of review that maybe are 6 months or so, and then the larger projects that may require on-site visits and public hearings and all sorts of machinations at the PUC level, certainly can take a year, 2 years. And of course, depending on appeals and things like that, or outstanding, or some of them might require environmental permits, above and beyond the certificate of public good, and those environmental permits might be wetlands permit or stormwater permit, or some other type of approval, and so those are kind of like side issues that feed into the PUC process, but those alone can add months and months and months to the process.
So on balance, do you think the system we have works well, that it sort of straddles the desire to protect the environment and not allow some kind of reckless development, or something that isn't thought through very carefully to go forward, versus making the process sort of predictable and of a reasonable time frame, or are we not at that sweet spot?
That is such a good question. I don't really know how to answer it. I would say that one of the issues is just capacity to conduct the permitting, because, as I said, instead of having 1 or 2 projects every 5 years, now there's hundreds of projects a year. So it does strain capacity, and that in and of itself, I think, contributes to delays and complications. And all these smaller projects feeding into the distribution systems also, creates a bit of backlog working with the power companies too. So I don't know if any of that's really avoidable, but it's kind of inevitable. One of the things that I struggle with when I'm looking at these projects and the permitting for these projects is in the environmental review in particular, the state environmental agencies take a really close and hard look at these projects and the impacts that they're having on the Vermont environment, which is appropriate and understandable. But they kind of keep ratcheting up the standards of review and the permitting, to the point where it could have the effect of discouraging some of this local renewable energy generation. People just walk away. But as noted, there's going to be an increasing demand for electricity because we are electrifying a lot of things. The 2 biggest sectors of energy consumption are, thermal, building heat and cooling, and transportation, fuel for our vehicles, especially our cars and light duty trucks. And the amount of electricity that we're going to need over the next 30 years or so, based on projections, suggests that we're going to have to, even with conservation and efficiency measures, we're going to need to increase our electricity consumption by about 50%, which is a good thing in a lot of ways, right? Because you can obtain this electricity, this fuel from renewable sources, and it's much more efficient by and large than, combustion-based fossil fuel heating, cooling, and transportation. But that electricity has to come from somewhere. So if the local permitting process in Vermont becomes so complicated, then we wind up not getting enough. Well, I won't say enough. We get a lot less generation from in-state sources. So that means a lot of the electricity has to be imported into Vermont. And we don't have any environmental review authority over, renewable energy or any other kind of energy project that happens outside of Vermont. So, we say, oh, well, we've made it really difficult to do because of the permitting process, potentially, a wind energy project in Vermont, say. So we got to get the electricity from somewhere. So even if we want to get it from a quote unquote renewable source, what's that going to be? Well, we've gotten the majority of our renewable energy in Vermont, so-called renewable energy in Vermont, is from imported hydroelectric sources, especially Hydro-Quebec. And so now we're very concerned about environmental impacts of generation in Vermont, but we say, well, we can't do it in Vermont, so we'll import it, and we'll import it from Hydro-Quebec and pretend that doesn't have any environmental impacts. Whereas, those dams up there in Quebec and Labrador have already flooded forest land equal in area to the entire state of Vermont. So I'm not sure if our rigid environmental standards for this stuff is really fair, in that it only considers environmental impacts of generation in the state of Vermont, whereas wherever our electricity comes from, it's going to have environmental impacts. So somehow we need to balance that, if that makes any sense.
Do you think it's important that close to 100% of Vermont's energy needs are met from internal to Vermont, that it's not imported from elsewhere? Or is that just simply not practical? I mean,
I don't think it's fully practical. I think there's always going to have to be a significant amount of imported energy. Hopefully, most of it will be, electricity from renewable sources or other renewable energy, like, wood or biomass from nearby forest resources, especially for heating. But I think that there is a real danger of relying too much on imports, because we ultimately don't control that. As I said, we don't control the environmental impacts of that stuff, and we can't really. All we are is a small player in the market for that electricity too, so it's hard to count on that going forward in the future, when major metropolitan areas like New York City and Boston and the whole Eastern Corridor are going to start looking for more and more and more renewable electricity. And is there going to be enough to go around for Vermont? So I like to think that the more that we can do from local generation, the more control we have over our future electricity supplies. So it's never going to be 100%. We just don't. I don't think that we have the resources to be able to do that. But I do think it probably makes sense to strive for 50% or so.
So that suggests then that building transmission lines to import the energy from wherever will be a very big deal in the coming 10 or 15 years, as we try to get to 2030 and 2035 without allowing sales of internal combustion engine cars anymore. Do you anticipate that that's going to be a very tall order to build enough transmission lines and get the grid as robust as necessary as need be to meet those goals?
Well, there's work to be done there to be sure, and I have to say that the technical expertise associated with figuring out what's needed for our distribution, our transmission and distribution systems is way beyond me. I've always considered that one of the great mysteries, and how those engineers that are involved in that are able to figure out how much we need to import at any one time and how much we can export and how much we need to use and how we balance the grid so that we're consuming the exact same amount that we're producing. So it's just mind-boggling. But yeah, there'll definitely need to be upgrades. And I know that Valco, the transmission company, and Green Mountain Power, the distribution company in our area, are very keenly aware of the increasing demands for electricity and the needs for upgrade. And they are all very much engaged in, assessing the capacity and strength of their system and where upgrades are going to be needed. And in discussions with them, amazingly, they recognize those needs, but they don't think that those are insurmountable problems. I mean, they're expensive. They can be controversial in places if you need to build a new transmission line or something. But by and large, they feel that those things are doable. So I think ultimately it's not the transmission and the distribution systems that are going to be the constraint on our ability to use electricity.
And how does Act 250 work into all of this? I know, if I recall correctly, the Act 250 bill that the legislature came up with earlier this year, and it was ultimately vetoed by the governor, and I don't think it was, I'm pretty sure it wasn't the veto wasn't overruled, if I'm remembering this correctly. Attempted to kind of address some of these permitting issues by, speeding up or changing the environmental court review. I'm trying to remember exactly. Seth Bongartz explained this to me once at one point, and I've just forgotten now. But as it currently stands right now, is Act 250, kind of on balance, being a help or a hindrance to some of this stuff?
Well, in the area of energy projects in particular, it's not generally a big player because the PUC Section 248 process really takes the place of Act 250 for energy projects. There are some projects that have a separate land use component to them that might also require Act 250 review and approval. I remember there was a big debate and discussion a few years back when there was a biomass power plant proposed down in Pownell that would have burned wood to produce electricity and use the waste heat for I think pellet manufacturing process. And so there was a lot of discussion around that one as to whether or not a separate Act 250 permit would be required in addition to the 248 permit. And, it seemed like there was a lot of duplicative review in that case, potentially. So eventually that application was withdrawn. So I don't know if that issue ever really got fully resolved. but yeah, the changes proposed for Act 250, and they've been talked about on and off over the years. There's certainly some good ideas. Again, that's something that was put in place a long time ago, and it's certainly could be reviewed and discussed and probably streamlined in some places. I have struggled with some of the state environmental permitting, Act 250 and otherwise. And, for some of the public benefit projects that we're involved in at the regional commission, things like, bike path projects and things like, it seems like they should be pretty much simple no-brainer projects, and they get really bogged down. And I said, I feel the pain in those cases. But yeah, I think there's a lot of issues with Act 250. Again, a lot of it's, capacity stuff, just, keeping the district environmental offices up this full staffing levels. And Act 250 in and of itself is as much as anything, it has a land use planning component to it, or land use permitting component to it, but it also is kind of a clearinghouse for a lot of state environmental permits. So, you might be fine with your land use, from a land use perspective, that this is an appropriate use in an appropriate place and it's consistent with the town plan and with the regional plan. But then you need, a wetlands permit and a permit to build in a floodplain, or a stormwater discharge permit, or, any, potential impact on rare, natural areas and things like that. So you have to get all these other environmental permits in place, environmental and other, like transportation approvals and everything else. So a lot of times Act 250 gets pointed to as the real problem, but sometimes the Act 250 thing is really, it's just kind of like the big piece that's waiting around for all the smaller pieces. And so it's all those permitting processes in the various state agencies that take so much time.
Permitting will remain a contentious arena as competing groups will continue to interact over what makes the most sense to create the best version of Vermont. And we may not have heard the last from Jim Sullivan either. For the GNAT-TV News Project, I'm Andrew McKeever.